Chapter 1. The Stormy Wager. The rain lashed against the tall windows of Willow Hall, each gust rattling the panes as if the storm itself were demanding entry. Inside, the drawing-room glowed with the warmth of a crackling fire, though the flickering light did little to ease the tension among the guests. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the hearth, knitted quietly, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, unremarkable in her tweed skirt and lavender cardigan. But her sharp eyes, darting from face to face, missed nothing. The gathering was an unusual one for St. Mary Mead, a village more accustomed to church fetes than high-stakes intrigue. Sir Henry Ashford, the new owner of Willow Hall, had invited a curious mix of locals and strangers to his recently inherited manor. The occasion, he claimed, was to celebrate his arrival, but Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of purpose in his jovial demeanour. Sir Henry, a robust man with a booming voice and a penchant for theatrics, stood at the head of the room, a glass of brandy in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his eyes glinting with mischief, "tonight is no ordinary evening. I propose a wager, a game, if you will, to enliven our dreary weather. A test of wit, nerve, and perhaps a touch of daring." The room stirred. Mrs. Clara Bantry, perched on a velvet settee, raised an eyebrow, her husband, Colonel Bantry, muttering something about foolish nonsense. Young Dr. Lionel Haworth, the village's new physician, leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. Beside him, Miss Evelyn Carver, a sharp-tongued heiress from London, smirked as if she already knew the game's outcome. At the far end of the room, Mr. Rupert Finch, a reclusive antiquarian with a nervous tic, clutched his pocket-watch tightly. And then there was Mrs. Lavinia Gray, a widow of indeterminate age, whose serene smile seemed at odds with the storm. Outside, Miss Marple's needles paused as Sir Henry continued. "The prize," he said, lowering his voice for effect, "is a relic of immense value, an artifact from my late uncle's collection, a jade figurine said to carry a curse." He chuckled, but no one joined him. "The terms are simple. Each of you will stake something of equal worth, be it money, a secret, or a promise. By week's end, the one who proves their wager's worth through cunning or proof shall claim the figurine. But beware, once you're in, there's no turning back." A murmur rippled through the room. Colonel Bantry scoffed, declaring it a lot of rot. But Mrs. Bantry hushed him, her eyes gleaming with intrigue. Dr. Haworth asked for details about the figurine, while Miss Carver's smirk widened, as if she relished the challenge. Mr. Finch's tic grew more pronounced, and Mrs. Gray's smile faltered for the briefest moment. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind already turning. A bet, she knew, was never just a bet. In her long experience, wagers had a way of unmasking greed, envy, and darker impulses. She glanced at Sir Henry, noting the sly satisfaction in his expression. He was no fool, she thought, but neither was he entirely honest. As the guests debated whether to join the wager, a clap of thunder shook the hall, and the lights flickered. In that fleeting darkness, Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. Something about this game, its stakes, its players, or its master, felt terribly wrong. By the time the lights returned, 5 had agreed to the wager. Dr. Haworth, Miss Carver, Mr. Finch, Mrs. Gray, and, to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Bantry, who declared she couldn't resist a bit of fun. Sir Henry clapped his hands, delighted, and produced a leather-bound ledger to record the pledges. Each participant whispered their stake to him, and he scribbled with a flourish, sealing their fates. Miss Marple declined to join, citing her age and preference for simpler pleasures. But as she watched the ledger pass from hand to hand, she memorized every gesture, every glance. The storm raged on, and the fire cast long shadows across the room. To Miss Marple, those shadows seemed to whisper of secrets, and of a tragedy yet to unfold. Chapter 2. Faces at the table the storm showed no sign of relenting as the guests at Willow Hall lingered in the drawing-room, the air thick with the scent of damp wool and wood smoke. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting now a mere prop, sat quietly in her corner, her eyes flitting from one face to another. The wager had been set, the ledger closed, but the real game, she knew, was just beginning. People revealed themselves not in their words, but in the flicker of a glance, the tightening of a hand, the pause before a laugh. And tonight, every guest was a study in contrasts. Sir Henry Ashford, the host, stood by the fireplace, his broad shoulders squared as he regaled Colonel Bantry with tales of his uncle's travels. His charm was effortless, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted to the ledger, now resting on a mahogany side table. He was a man who enjoyed control, she thought, and this wager was his stage. Yet there was something in his posture, a faint rigidity, that suggested he was not as carefree as he seemed. Mrs. Clara Bantry, ever the spirited counterpart to her grumbling husband, sipped her sherry with a gleam of mischief. She had joined, the wager on a whim, or so she claimed. But Miss Marple suspected Clara's impulsiveness masked a sharper intent. The Bantrys were not wealthy, and Clara's eyes lingered on the jade figurine Sir Henry had described. Greed? Or something else? Miss Marple filed the thought away. Dr. Lionel Haworth, the young physician, paced near the window, his lean frame silhouetted against the rain-streaked glass. He was new to St. Mary Mead, his arrival barely a month past, and his earnest demeanour had already won the village's trust. But tonight his questions about the figurine's history had been too precise, too probing. A scholar's curiosity, perhaps, or a man with a deeper stake in the game. His fingers tapped a restless rhythm on his cufflink, a silver piece engraved with an unfamiliar crest. Miss Evelyn Carver, the London heiress, reclined on a chaise longue, her silk dress catching the firelight. Her sharp wit and sharper tongue had already unsettled several guests, particularly Mr. Finch, whom she teased about his dusty old books. Evelyn's confidence bordered on arrogance, but Miss Marple caught the fleeting shadow in her eyes when Sir Henry mentioned the figurine's curse. Fear or guilt, either way, she was a woman accustomed to winning, and losing was not in her nature. Mr. Rupert Finch, the antiquarian, hovered near the bookshelves, his thin frame hunched as if to make himself smaller. His nervous tick, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, worsened under Evelyn's barbs, but Miss Marple noticed his hands were steady as he adjusted his spectacles. He had agreed to the wager reluctantly, muttering about historical significance. Yet his gaze kept straying to Mrs. Gray. An old acquaintance, perhaps, or something more troubling. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, the widow, sat apart, her hands folded, serenely in her lap. Her pale blue eyes held a quiet intensity, and her smile, though gentle, seemed to guard a secret. She had joined the wager with little hesitation, offering her stake in a whisper that made Sir Henry nod gravely. Miss Marple, who had known many widows in her time, recognized the steel beneath Lavinia's composure. This was a woman who had weathered storms of her own. The Colonel, though not a participant, grumbled loudly about the damned foolishness of the wager, his face reddening with each sip of whisky. Miss Marple suspected his bluster was partly for show, a shield for his discomfort in Sir Henry's opulent manner. The Bantrys were old money, but Willow Hall's grandeur was a different breed, and the Colonel's unease was palpable. As the shim clock struck 10, Sir Henry clapped his hands, calling for another round of drinks. The guests moved, some to the bar, others to cluster in pairs, their voices low. Miss Marple watched Evelyn sidle up to Dr. Haworth, her laughter too bright, while Mr. Finch whispered urgently to Mrs. Grey, who nodded once, her expression unreadable. Clara Bantry, meanwhile, hovered near the ledger, her fingers brushing its cover before she caught herself and turned away. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She had seen gatherings like this before, people bound by chance, ambition, or secrets, each playing a role. The wager was a spark, and sparks, she knew, could ignite fires. As the storm roared outside, she felt a prickle of foreboding. The faces at the table were not just players in a game. They were pieces on a board, and someone, she was certain, was already planning their next move. Chapter 3. The Omen in the Ashes. The storm had settled into a relentless rhythm, its howl muffled by the thick walls of Willow Hall. In the drawing-room, the guests' chatter had grown strained, the initial thrill of the wager giving way to an uneasy silence. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, watched the fire's glow dance across the faces of the wager's players. The ledger, still on the side table, seemed to draw glances like a magnet, though none dared approach it now. It was Mrs. Bantry who broke the tension, rising with a dramatic shiver. "This room's grown chilly," she declared, striding to the fireplace. "Let's have a proper blaze, shall we?" She seized the poker and jabbed at the logs, sending sparks spiralling up the chimney. But as the flames flared, something caught her eye. She froze, the poker dangling in her hand. "Good heavens," she murmured, leaning closer. "What's this?" The guests turned, curiosity overriding their unease. Miss Marple, ever alert, set her knitting aside and joined Mrs. Bantry at the hearth. There, among the ashes, lay a charred fragment of paper, its edges curled like blackened petals. Mrs. Bantry, with a boldness that belied her earlier levity, plucked it from the embers, blowing gently to cool it. "It's writing," she said, squinting. "A letter, perhaps." Sir Henry, his jovial mask slipping for a moment, crossed the room in 3 strides. "Let me see that," he said, his tone sharper than intended. He took the fragment, holding it to the light. The ink was faded, the script jagged, but a few words were legible. Debt unpaid, blood will. The rest was lost to the fire's hunger. A murmur rippled through the room. Miss Evelyn Carver, her smirk gone, leaned forward. "Blood? That's rather theatrical, don't you think?" Her voice was light, but her fingers tightened around her glass. Dr. Hayworth, peering over Sir Henry's shoulder, frowned. His scholarly instincts stirred. "It could be old," he said. "From your uncle's time, perhaps. But the ink looks recent." Mr. Finch, still by the bookshelves, twitched violently, his spectacles glinting as he turned away. Mrs. Gray, serene as ever, tilted her head, her eyes fixed on the fragment as if it held a secret only she could decipher. Colonel Bantry, roused from his whisky-induced haze, grumbled, "Probably some servant's nonsense. People burn all sorts of rubbish." Miss Marple, standing quietly beside Mrs. Bantry, said nothing. She noted the way Sir Henry's hand trembled as he folded the fragment into his pocket, his smile returning too quickly. She observed Mr. Finch's sudden interest in a book he hadn't opened all evening, and the faint flush on Mrs. Gray's cheeks, barely visible in the firelight. Most of all, she marked the silence that followed, a silence heavy with unspoken questions. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said at last, her voice mild. "It's a relic of some old quarrel. Fires, you know, have a way of preserving as much as they destroy." Her words were gentle, but they landed like pebbles in a still pond, rippling through the room. Sir Henry clapped his hands too loudly. "Nonsense! A bit of old paper, nothing more. Let's not let it spoil our evening." He called for more drinks, and the guests, eager to shake off the unease, drifted back to their conversations. But the mood had shifted, as if the storm had slipped inside, curling around their thoughts. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her mind turning over the fragment's words. Debt unpaid. Blood will. They were not idle, she was certain. In her experience, such phrases were rarely accidents. They were warnings or promises, and in a game like this wager, they could be both. She glanced at the ledger, its leather cover gleaming faintly. Whatever the wager's true stakes, she thought, they were far higher than a jade figurine. As the fire crackled and the storm raged on, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles moving with deliberate calm. But her eyes never left the room, and her mind was already tracing the threads of a mystery that was no longer just a game. Chapter 4. Death Under the Roses. The storm had eased to a restless drizzle by morning, leaving Willow Hall shrouded in mist. Miss Jane Marple, an early riser despite the late night, stood at her guest-room window, peering into the gardens below. The roses, heavy with rain, drooped in their beds, their scarlet petals stark against the grey dawn. She had slept little, her mind tangled with the charred fragment's words, debt unpaid, blood will, and the uneasy glances of the wagers players. Something was amiss, and she felt it like a chill in her bones. Breakfast was to be served at 8, but a piercing scream shattered the morning's calm before the hour struck. It came from the garden, sharp and panicked, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. She slipped on her shawl and hurried downstairs, her sensible shoes tapping on the polished floors. Other guests emerged, bleary-eyed and alarmed, as Sir Henry, already at the front door, barked orders to a pale-faced maid. "It's Jenny, the gardener's girl," he said, his voice tight. "She found something." The group followed him into the rose garden, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and blooms. There, beneath a trellis laden with crimson roses, lay a body. It was Mr. Rupert Finch, the antiquarian, His thin frame sprawled unnaturally, his spectacles askew. His face was frozen in a grimace, and a dark stain spread across his waistcoat, glistening in the damp light. A gardening trowel, its blade blooded, lay discarded nearby. Mrs. Bantry gasped, clutching her husband's arm, while Colonel Bantry muttered, "Good God, man!" Miss Evelyn Carver, her face pale but composed, stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. Dr. Hayworth knelt beside the body, his physician's instincts overriding his shock. "He's been stabbed," he said, his voice steady but low. "Dead for hours, I'd wager. The rain's washed away much, but this wound—" He trailed, off, glancing at the trowel. Mrs. Gray, standing at the edge of the group, clasped her hands tightly, her serene mask cracking for the first time. Sir Henry, his joviality gone, looked from the body to the guests, his jaw set. "No one leaves the grounds," he said. "I've sent for Constable Reed." Miss Marple, unnoticed in the chaos, circled the scene, her eyes tracing the ground, the roses, the trellis. The trowel was an obvious weapon, but its placement felt staged, as if meant to be found. She noted the mud, churned by the rain, but undisturbed around Finch's body. No footprints, no struggle. And there, caught on a rose thorn, was a scrap of fabric, grey and fine, too delicate for a gardener's smock. She tucked the observation away, her face betraying nothing. The guests' reactions were a study in themselves. Evelyn's composure was too perfect, her eyes darting to Dr. Hayworth as if gauging his response. Mrs. Bantry's shock seemed genuine, but her hands fidgeted as if itching to act. Mrs. Gray's lips moved silently, perhaps in prayer, though. Her gaze lingered on Sir Henry. The Colonel, blustering about village safety, seemed eager to distance himself from the affair. And Sir Henry, his authority was firm, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of fear in his eyes, as if he knew more than he let on. Dr. Hayworth stood, wiping his hands. "We should cover him," he said. "The rain's already done enough damage." But Miss Marple, stepping forward, said softly, "Best not, Doctor. The police will want everything as it is." Her tone was gentle, but it carried weight, and Hayworth nodded, stepping back. As the group retreated to the hall to await the constable, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer. She knelt by the roses, her fingers brushing the petals. Finch had been nervous last night, his tic worsening under pressure, his whispers to Mrs. Gray urgent. Had he known something about the wager, its stakes, its secrets, that cost him his life? And the fragment in the ashes, blood will, was it a prophecy now fulfilled? The mist thickened, veiling the garden, but Miss Marple's mind was clear. A murder had been done, and the wager was no longer a game. Someone among them had played a deadly hand, and she would find them, one quiet step at a time. Chapter 5. Secrets in the Village. The morning mist had burned away, but a pall hung over Willow Hall as Constable Reed arrived, his notebook already open. He was a young man, earnest but out of his depth, and Miss Jane Marple watched him with a mix of sympathy and resolve. A murder in St. Mary Mead was no small matter, and she knew the village's secrets would not yield easily to official inquiries. She would have to tread her own path, as she always did, through the whispers and half-truths that wove the fabric of village life. The guests had been confined to the drawing-room, their breakfast untouched, as Reed questioned them one by one. Miss Marple, excused for the moment, slipped into the village under the pretence of fetching a fresh skein of wool from Mrs. Price's shop. In truth, she sought the pulse of St. Mary Mead, the gossip that flowed like a river, carrying truths no constable could unearth. At the shop, Mrs. Price, a stout woman with a knack for knowing everyone's business, greeted her warmly. "Terrible business at the hall, Miss Marple," she said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Mr. Finch, of all people. Quiet sort, wasn't he? Kept to himself, always poking about old books and such." Miss Marple nodded, selecting a skein of blue wool. "Indeed, Mrs. Price. Did he ever speak of his work? Or perhaps of Sir Henry's family?" She kept her tone light, but her question was a hook, cast gently into the stream. Mrs. Price leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Well, now you mention it, he was in here last week, asking about old Mr. Ashford, Sir Henry's uncle, you know. Wanted to know about his travels, his collections. Said he'd found something odd in a book from the hall's library. Wouldn't say what, mind, but he looked proper rattled." Miss Marple's fingers paused on the wool. "Odd, you say? How curious." She smiled, encouraging more. "And that's not all," Mrs. Price continued, warming to her tale. "Jenny, the gardener's girl, told me Mr. Finch was seen arguing with Mrs. Gray near the church 2 days ago. Whispering fierce, and he stormed off. Never thought Mrs. Gray had it in her to argue, all calm and saintly as she seems." Miss Marple filed this away, her mind turning to Mrs. Gray's serene facade and Finch's urgent whispers the night of the wager. Back at Willow Hall, she found the guests restless, their nerves frayed by Reed's plodding questions. Sir Henry paced by the window, his earlier charm replaced by a grim intensity. Mrs. Bantry fidgeted with her necklace, her usual vivacity subdued. Miss Evelyn Carver sat apart, her eyes cold and calculating, while Dr. Hayworth scribbled in a small notebook, his face unreadable. Mrs. Gray, as ever, was a picture of composure, though her hands were clasped a touch too tightly. Seizing a moment, Miss Marple approached Mrs. Bantry, who was eager to talk. "Clara, dear," she said, her voice soft, "did you know Mr. Finch well? He seemed so reserved, yet I wonder if he had ties here in the village." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Not well, Jane, but I heard things. He was obsessed with old artefacts, you know. Colonel heard him talking to Dr. Hayworth about that jade figurine. Said it wasn't just valuable, but dangerous. Something about a curse, though. I thought it nonsense." She lowered her voice. "And I saw him with Evelyn Carver the day before the wager, outside the post office. They didn't look friendly." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Evelyn's confidence, Finch's nerves, Mrs. Gray's secrets. Each thread wove back to the wager. She recalled the scrap of grey fabric caught on the rose thorn. Mrs. Gray's shawl, she now remembered, was a fine grey weave, though it had been absent this morning. A coincidence, or a clue? As Reed called Sir Henry for another round of questions, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed but her mind racing. Finch's death was no random act. He had known something, perhaps about the figurine, or the wager's true stakes. The village whispered of debts and quarrels, and the charred fragment, blood will, loomed larger in her thoughts. Someone had silenced Finch, and the killer was likely among them, watching, waiting. She glanced at the ledger, still on the side table, its pages untouched since the wager was sealed. What had Finch pledged? And what had he uncovered that cost him his life? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a steady counterpoint to the storm brewing within the hall. Chapter 6. The Vanishing Stake. The afternoon sun struggled through the clouds, casting a pale light over Willow Hall, but the gloom inside was unshaken. Mr. Rupert Finch's murder hung over the guests like a spectre, and Constable Reed's methodical questioning had yielded little beyond frayed tempers. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the drawing-room's bay window, knitted with apparent calm, though her eyes missed nothing. The twitch of a hand, the flicker of a glance, the weight of unspoken fears. The ledger, still on the mahogany side table, had become a silent accusation, its sealed pledges now tainted by death. Sir Henry, his face drawn, had taken to guarding it, though he claimed it was merely to preserve order. Miss Marple suspected he feared what those pages might reveal. The wager's prize, the jade figurine, was the key, she was certain, and its rumoured curse now seemed less fanciful in the wake of bloodshed. It was Dr. Haworth who shattered the uneasy quiet. He had been restless all morning, his scholarly composure fraying, and now he approached Sir Henry with a furrowed brow. "Sir Henry," he said, his voice low but urgent, "where is the figurine? You said it was secure, but with Finch's death, shouldn't we confirm it's safe?" The room stilled. Mrs. Bantry looked up from her teacup, her eyes sharp. Miss Evelyn Carver, lounging by the fireplace, arched an eyebrow, while Mrs. Gray's serene gaze flickered with something unreadable. Sir Henry, caught off guard, cleared his throat. "It's in the study, locked in my safe. Perfectly secure." "Perhaps we should see it," Evelyn said, her tone deceptively casual. Given the circumstances, transparency would be reassuring. Sir Henry hesitated, then nodded, perhaps sensing the growing suspicion. "Very well. Follow me." The group trailed him to the study, a dimly lit room lined with books and heavy with the scent of leather and polish. Sir Henry knelt by a small safe behind his desk, twisting the dial with practised ease. The door swung open, and his face fell. "It's gone," he whispered, his voice hollow. A gasp rippled through the group. The safe was empty, save for a velvet cloth where the figurine should have rested. Mrs. Bantry clutched her husband's arm, muttering, "First Finch, now this." Evelyn's lips curled into a faint smile, as if she'd expected no less, while Dr. Haworth's hands clenched, his cufflink glinting with that curious crest. Mrs. Gray remained silent, but her eyes darted to the ledger, still in Sir Henry's possession. Miss Marple, standing at the back, noted the chaos with quiet clarity. The figurine's disappearance was no accident. It was a calculated move tied to Finch's murder. She recalled his obsession with the artifact, his whispered argument with Mrs. Gray, his tension with Evelyn. Had he discovered something about the figurine, its value, its curse, or its history? That made him a threat. Constable Reed, summoned to the study, scribbled furiously in his notebook, but his questions were blunt, lacking finesse. Who had access to the safe? He demanded. Sir Henry admitted only he knew the combination, though the study door was often unlocked. The guests exchanged wary glances, each silently accusing the other. As they returned to the drawing-room, Miss Marple lingered in the study, Her eyes scanning the desk, a faint scratch on the safe's dial caught her attention, fresh, as if someone had tampered with it. Nearby, a single rose petal, crimson and crushed, lay on the carpet, its edges curling. She thought of the rose garden, the bloodied trowel, the grey fabric on the thorn. The pieces were connecting, but the picture remained elusive. Back in the drawing-room, tempers flared. Evelyn accused Sir Henry of staging the theft to void the wager, while Dr. Hayworth pressed him on the figurine's origins, his questions edged with suspicion. Mrs. Gray, ever calm, suggested the thief might be an outsider, but her words rang hollow. Mrs. Bantry, her nerves fraying, snapped, "This is no game any more. Someone's dead, and now the prize is gone." Miss Marple, resuming her knitting, let the arguments wash over her. The figurine's theft was a bold stroke, meant to disrupt or conceal. Finch had known something, and his killer had acted to protect it. The grey fabric, the rose petal, the scratched safe, they were threads in a tapestry of deceit, and the ledger, she thought, glancing at its guarded place by Sir Henry's side, held the key to the stakes each had pledged. As the guests dispersed, their trust in one another crumbling, Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. The wager had claimed one life, and the vanishing stake had raised the stakes higher still. She would unravel this knot, she resolved, before the killer struck again. Chapter 7. Shadows of the Past. The late afternoon light filtered weakly through Willow Halls, tall windows casting long shadows across the drawing-room. The guests, confined by Constable Reed's orders, moved restlessly, their voices sharp with accusation and fear. The murder of Mr. Rupert Finch and the theft of the jade figurine had stripped away any pretence of civility, leaving raw suspicion in its place. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner, knitted with quiet purpose, her eyes tracing the fraying threads of trust among the wager's players. She had not been idle. Earlier, while the others argued over the figurine's disappearance, Miss Marple had slipped into the library, a musty room adjacent to Sir Henry's study. Mr. Finch, she recalled, had hovered near the bookshelves the night of the wager, his nervous tick betraying an interest beyond idle curiosity. If he had uncovered something about the figurine, or the wager itself, it might lie among the late Mr. Ashford's papers. The library yielded its secret in a dusty box tucked behind a row of leather-bound volumes. Inside were letters, yellowed and brittle, tied with a faded ribbon. Miss Marple, careful not to tear the fragile pages, scanned them under the light of a flickering lamp. They were correspondences between Sir Henry's uncle, Reginald Ashford, and a man named Thomas Gray, dated some 30 years prior. The name struck a chord. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, the serene widow, had joined the wager with unsettling calm. Could this be her late husband? The letters spoke of a venture gone sour, a joint expedition to acquire rare artifacts, including a jade figurine rumoured to bring misfortune. Thomas Gray had accused Reginald of deceit, claiming the figurine's curse had brought ruin to his family. One letter, penned in a shaking hand, ended with a chilling vow. "Your debt will be paid, Ashford, in coin or blood." Miss Marple's breath caught. The charred fragment from the fireplace, "debt unpaid, blood will," echoed these words too closely to be coincidence. Back in the drawing-room, she observed the guests with renewed focus. Mrs. Gray sat apart, her hands folded, but her eyes, usually so steady, flickered when Sir Henry mentioned his uncle's collection. Had she known of the letters? Had Finch, with his antiquarian's zeal, uncovered them and confronted her? Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Price's gossip, Finch and Mrs. Grey arguing by the church, his face pale with anger. The other guests were no less telling. Miss Evelyn Carver, her sharp wit now a weapon, needled Dr. Haworth about his interest in the figurine, her insinuations drawing a flush to his cheeks. "You're awfully keen on that relic, Doctor," she said, her smile cold. "Know something we don't?" Haworth's response was curt, his hand brushing the cufflink with its odd crest, a gesture Miss Marple now recognised as a nervous tell. Mrs. Bantry, her nerves stretched thin, confided in Miss Marple over tea. "I shouldn't have joined this wretched wager," she whispered. "Finch told me something odd that night, said the figurine wasn't Sir Henry's to give. I thought he was just rattled, but now—" Her voice trailed off, her eyes darting to Sir Henry, who stood by the ledger, his expression grim. Sir Henry himself was a study in strain. His charm had eroded, replaced by a defensive edge, when Constable Reed pressed him about the safes. "Security!" he snapped. "I'm no thief!" A denial that rang hollow to Miss Marple's ears. The scratch on the safe's dial, the rose petal in the study. Someone had planned the theft, and Sir Henry's agitation suggested he feared more than the loss of the figurine. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the letters. Thomas Gray's vow of vengeance, the figurine's curse, Finch's murder. They were linked, she was certain, to the wager's true purpose. Had Finch threatened to expose a scandal? Had Mrs. Gray, or someone else, silenced him to protect a secret? The grey fabric on the rose thorn, she noted, matched Mrs. Gray's shawl, but Evelyn's scarf, glimpsed that morning, was a similar shade. A deliberate misdirection, perhaps. As evening fell, the guests' accusations grew bolder. Evelyn suggested Dr. Haworth's medical knowledge made him adept at murder, while Haworth countered that Evelyn's wealth gave her motive to steal the figurine. Mrs. Gray remained silent, but her gaze lingered on the ledger, as if it held her fate. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, wove the clues together. The letters, the fabric, the petal, the wager. The past had cast a long shadow, and its darkness was far from spent. Chapter 8. The alibi unravels. The evening air in Willow. Hall was thick with distrust, the guests' voices sharp as they traded accusations in the drawing-room. Mr. Rupert Finch's murder and the theft of the jade figurine had fractured their fragile civility, and Constable Reed's plodding investigation only fueled their unease. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the fire with her knitting, observed the chaos with quiet clarity, her mind sifting through the clues. The charred letter fragment, the grey fabric, the rose petal, and the old letters tying the wager to a decades-old grudge. Her attention had settled on Miss Evelyn Carver, whose sharp tongue and calculated poise marked her as a player in more than just the wager. During Reed's questioning, Evelyn had claimed to be in her room the night of Finch's murder, reading until midnight with no one to corroborate her story. "I prefer my own company," she'd said, her smile defiant. But Miss Marple, ever attuned to detail, recalled a discrepancy. The maid, Jenny, had mentioned seeing a woman in a grey scarf near the rose garden that evening, her silhouette fleeting in the storm's glow. Evelyn's scarf, glimpsed that morning, was grey silk, its shade eerily close to the fabric caught on the rose thorn. Miss Marple tested her theory subtly, engaging Evelyn in idle chat over tea. "You must find our village quiet after London," she said, her tone mild. "Though I suppose the storm kept you indoors, reading by lamplight?" Evelyn nodded, but her fingers tightened on her cup, and her eyes flicked to Dr. Haworth, who was arguing with Sir Henry across the room. "Yes, quite," she replied, too quickly. Miss Marple noted the hesitation, the glance, a crack in Evelyn's polished alibi. Before she could probe further, a commotion erupted. Mrs. Bantry, who had slipped away to the library for a moment's respite, returned pale and trembling, clutching a torn page. "It's from the ledger," she gasped, holding it aloft. The room fell silent as Sir Henry snatched the page, his face ashen. The paper, ripped from the wages record, listed Finch's pledge, a document proving the figurine's illicit origins. The other pledges remained intact, but the tear was deliberate, the ink smudged as if handled in haste. Constable Reed, flustered, demanded to know who had access to the ledger. Sir Henry admitted it had been left briefly unattended during the morning's chaos, but his eyes darted to Mrs. Gray, who stood serene yet rigid. Mrs. Bantry, her voice shaking, said, "I found it under a cushion in the library. Someone hid it. Accusations flew." Evelyn pointed at Dr. Haworth, citing his nervous scribbling. Haworth accused Sir Henry of covering his own tracks. Mrs. Gray suggested an outsider, though her calm seemed forced. Miss Marple, unnoticed, examined the torn page when Reed set it down. The smudge was fresh, and a faint scent of lavender clung to it. Mrs. Gray's perfume, she recalled, though Evelyn used a similar scent. Another misdirection? The page confirmed Finch's dangerous knowledge. He had evidence the figurine was tied to a crime, likely the scandal in the old letters between Reginald Ashford and Thomas Gray. Had he threatened to expose it, prompting his murder? As Reed called for calm, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp cry from the hall. The guests rushed to find Jenny, the maid, clutching her arm, blood seeping through her sleeve. "Someone pushed me," she stammered. "In the corridor, dark, didn't see." A heavy candlestick lay nearby, its base smeared with blood. The second crime sent panic through the group, and Reed's authority faltered. Miss Marple knelt by Jenny, her eyes scanning the scene. The corridor was dim, but a single rose petal, fresh and crimson, lay near the candlestick, too pristine for chance. She recalled the petal in the study, the rose garden's role in Finch's death. Someone was weaving a pattern, taunting or careless. Jenny, trembling, whispered, "I saw someone near the garden last night. Thought it was Miss Carver, but it was so dark." The guests returned to the drawing room, their fear palpable. Evelyn's alibi was crumbling, but the attack on Jenny suggested the killer was desperate, perhaps cornered. Mrs. Gray's lavender scent, Dr. Haworth's cufflink, Sir Henry's defensiveness, each was a thread in the tapestry. And the ledger, now compromised, held secrets yet to be revealed. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles a steady rhythm against the storm of suspicion. The killer had struck again, but in their haste they had left clues. She would follow them, step by quiet step, before the wager claimed another life. Chapter 9. The Gathering Storm. The late morning light did little to dispel the oppressive air in Willow Hall, where the guests remained trapped by suspicion and Constable Reed's faltering investigation. Mr. Finch's murder, the stolen jade, figurine, the torn ledger page, and the attack on Jenny had woven a web of fear, and the killer's shadow loomed larger with each passing hour. Miss Jane Marple, ever the quiet observer, sensed the moment was ripe for a nudge. People, she knew, revealed their truths when their guards were down, and nothing lowered defences like a proper tea. With Sir Henry's reluctant permission, she arranged a tea party in the drawing-room, insisting it would steady everyone's nerves. The table was set with fine china, scones, and a pot of Darjeeling, and Miss Marple, in her lavender cardigan, played the perfect hostess, her smile disarming. The guests, weary and wary, took their seats, their eyes darting to the ledger, now under Reed's guard on the side table. "Such a trying time," Miss Marple began, pouring tea with deliberate care. "But in my experience, a cup of tea and a bit of talk can clarify things. Mr. Finch, poor man, seemed so troubled that night. Did he speak to any of you about the wager's prize?" Her tone was gentle, but her question was a spark, igniting flickers of unease. Mrs. Bantry, nibbling a scone, spoke first, her voice tight. "He did say something to me, about the figurine not belonging to Sir Henry. I thought he was just nervous, but now, with that ledger page," she glanced at Sir Henry, who stiffened, his teaspoon clattering against his saucer. "Preposterous," Sir Henry snapped. "My uncle's collection was entirely legitimate. Finch was a meddler, stirring up trouble." But his eyes flicked to Mrs. Gray, whose serene facade wavered, her fingers brushing the edge of her teacup. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Gray, her voice soft. "You knew Mr. Finch before, didn't you, dear? I heard you were seen speaking near the church. An old acquaintance, perhaps?" The question hung in the air, and the room stilled. Mrs. Gray's calm cracked, her lips parting as if to protest, but she recovered quickly. "We discussed books," she said, her voice steady but thin. "He admired my late husband's library, nothing more." Yet her hand trembled, and Miss Marple noted the faint scent of lavender, a match for the smudge on the torn ledger page. Miss Evelyn Carver, her composure fraying, laughed sharply. "Books? Really, Mrs. Gray? You expect us to believe that? Finch was sniffing around everyone, and you've been far too calm for a woman in a murder house." Her accusation drew gasps, and Dr. Hayworth, his face flushed, leapt to Mrs. Gray's defence. "Leave her be, Evelyn," he said, his voice tight. "Finch was the one causing trouble, not her. He cornered me about the figurine's history, said it was stolen from a temple. I told him to drop it, but he wouldn't listen." His cufflink gleamed as he gestured, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Had Finch's questions threatened Hayworth's own secrets? The tea party teetered on the edge of chaos, voices rising. Mrs. Bantry admitted to touching the ledger that morning, just out of curiosity, but swore she hadn't torn the page. Sir Henry accused Evelyn of sowing discord to deflect suspicion, while Evelyn retorted that his safe's theft was too convenient. Mrs. Gray, pressed by Miss Marple's gentle probing, let slip a startling detail. "My husband, Thomas, knew Reginald Ashford. They quarrelled over artefacts years ago. Finch asked me about it, but I told him it was ancient history. Miss Marple's needles resting in her lap were still, but her mind raced. Thomas Gray's letters, vowing vengeance, now tied directly to Mrs. Gray. Had Finch uncovered her connection to the figurine scandal? The rose petal near Jenny's attack, the grey fabric, the lavender scent. Clues pointed to Mrs. Gray. Yet Evelyn's shaky alibi and Hayworth's defensiveness muddied the waters. As the tea party dissolved into bitter silence, Constable Reed entered, his face grim. "We've found something," he said, holding up a small key, its surface scratched. It was in the rose garden, near where Finch was found. Might fit the safe. The guests froze, their eyes locking on Sir Henry, whose face drained of colour. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene. The key was a new thread, but the confessions, Mrs. Gray's past, Hayworth's admission, Evelyn's venom, had unravelled more than the guests realised. The killer was among them, and their mask was slipping. The storm was gathering, and Miss Marple was ready for its climax. Chapter 10. The Hidden Room. The atmosphere in Willow Hall had grown brittle, each glance among the guests laced with suspicion. The discovery of the scratched key in the rose garden had intensified Constable Reed's scrutiny, but his questions yielded only deflections and half-truths. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting a quiet constant, sensed the killer was cornered, their moves growing bolder and sloppier. The tea party had loosened tongues, but the truth lay deeper, hidden in the hall's very walls. Miss Marple's suspicions had been piqued by the library, where Mr. Finch had lingered the night of the wager, and where the torn ledger page was found. Late that afternoon, while the guests were distracted by Reed's latest round of interviews, she returned to the library, her steps soft on the creaking floorboards. The old letters between Reginald Ashford and Thomas Gray had hinted at secrets tied to the jade figurine, and Finch's antiquarian instincts had led him somewhere in this room. She was determined to follow his trail. Running her fingers along the bookshelves, Miss Marple noticed a faint draught where none should be. Behind a row of dusty tomes, a panel of wood felt loose, its edges misaligned. With a gentle push, it clicked, and a section of the shelf swung inward, revealing a narrow door. Her heart quickened, but her expression remained serene. St. Mary Mead, she thought, always had its surprises. The hidden room was small, its air stale and heavy with the scent of old paper. A single oil lamp, left unlit, sat on a table cluttered with documents, maps, and a small wooden box. Miss Marple lit the lamp, casting a flickering glow over the contents. The documents were receipts and ledgers from Reginald Ashford's expeditions, detailing the acquisition of artefacts, including the jade figurine marked as procured, under dispute, from a temple in 1895. A note in Thomas Gray's hand was pinned to one page. "Ashford's greed will damn us both." The wooden box, when opened, revealed a surprise. A photograph, faded but clear, showing Reginald Ashford and Thomas Gray, younger and stern, standing before a crate labelled Temple Relics. Beside them was a third man, his face partially, obscured but familiar. Miss Marple's breath caught as she recognised the crest on his cufflink, identical to Dr. Hayworth's. A relative, perhaps? The connection was no coincidence. Among the papers was a map of Willow Hall, with the rose garden circled in red ink. A scrawled note read, "Buried truth lies beneath the roses." Miss Marple's mind raced to the murder scene. The bloodied trowel, the rose petals scattered in the study and near Jenny's attack. Had Finch found this room and its secrets? Had he been digging, literally or figuratively, for the truth? She tucked the photograph and note into her pocket, closing the panel just as footsteps echoed in the library. It was Dr. Haworth, his face pale, his cufflink glinting as he scanned the shelves. "Miss Marple," he said, startled. "I was looking for a book." His excuse was weak, and his eyes lingered on the shelf where the hidden door lay. "Curious place, this library," she replied, her tone mild. "So many secrets in old books, don't you think?" Haworth's smile was strained, and he excused himself quickly. But Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow. He was searching for something, perhaps the same truth Finch had died for. Back in the drawing-room, the guests were at breaking point. Mrs. Bantry whispered to Miss Marple that Evelyn had been seen near the study the night of the figurines theft, her grey scarf trailing behind her. Mrs. Grey, meanwhile, avoided questions about her husband's feud with Ashford, her lavender scent still a nagging clue. Sir Henry, clutching the ledger, snapped at Reed's insistence on searching the safe again, his defensiveness bordering on panic. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the hidden room's revelations. The figurines' illicit origins, Thomas Gray's vow of vengeance, the mysterious man with Haworth's cufflink. They reframed the wager as a reckoning for past sins. Finch's pledge, a document proving the figurines' theft, had threatened someone's legacy or fortune. The rose garden, circled on the map, held more than a body. It held the key to the motive. As night fell, the guests' voices grew hushed, their fear palpable. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the photograph and note heavy in her pocket. The killer had struck to protect a secret buried in the past, but the hidden room had brought it to light. She was closer now, but the game was far from over. Chapter 11. Checkmate at Midnight. The clock in Willow Hall's drawing-room ticked toward midnight, its steady rhythm a stark contrast to the charged silence among the guests. The murders of Mr. Rupert Finch, the theft of the jade figurine, the attack on Jenny, and the secrets of the hidden room had brought the wager's deadly stakes into sharp focus. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting set aside, stood by the fire, her frail figure belying the steel in her gaze. She had gathered the suspects, Sir Henry, Mrs. Bantry, Miss Evelyn Carver, Dr. Haworth and Mrs. Grey, along with Constable Reed, under the pretence of sharing her observations. In truth, she was setting a trap. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice soft but commanding, "this wager has cost a life, perhaps more. But the truth, like a stubborn weed, always finds light. Let us piece it together, shall we?" The guests shifted uneasily, their eyes darting to the ledger, now open on the table, its torn page a silent accusation. Miss Marple held up the photograph from the hidden room, its faded image of Reginald Ashford, Thomas Gray, and the man with the familiar cufflink drawing gasps. "This," she said, "ties the figurine to a theft 30 years ago. A crime that ruined Thomas Gray and fueled his vow of vengeance." She glanced at Mrs. Gray, whose serene mask faltered, her hands clenching. "Mrs. Gray, your husband's feud with Ashford was no secret to Mr. Finch, was it?" He confronted you, believing you sought the figurine to settle an old score. Mrs. Gray's voice was barely a whisper. I wanted justice, not blood. Finch misunderstood. I told him to leave it alone. Her lavender scent wafted as she spoke, and Miss Marple recalled the smudged ledger page, the faint trace of the same perfume. Turning to Dr. Hayworth, Miss Marple tapped the photograph. Your cufflink, Doctor, matches this man's your father, I presume. A partner in Ashford's ventures, perhaps complicit in the figurine's theft. Finch's pledge, a document, proving its origins, threatened your family's name, didn't it? Hayworth's face paled, his hand brushing the cufflink. I didn't kill him, he stammered. I only wanted to know what he'd found. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes shifting to Evelyn. Miss Carver, your alibi for the night of Finch's murder was unconvincing. Jenny saw a woman in a grey scarf near the rose garden, and your scarf matches the fabric caught on a thorn. You were there, weren't you? Evelyn's smirk vanished, her voice sharp. I was curious, nothing more. Finch was muttering about the figurine. I followed him, but I didn't touch him. Sir Henry, his patience fraying, interrupted. This is absurd. The figurine's gone. Finch is dead. Why drag up the past? But Miss Marple's gaze pinned him. Sir Henry, your safe was scratched, the figurine stolen under your nose. You knew Finch's pledge could ruin your uncle's legacy, and your own. The rose petals found in the study and near Jenny's attack point to the garden, where your map marked a buried truth. What did you fear Finch would unearth? The room crackled with tension. Mrs. Bantry, her nerves shot, blurted, I saw Evelyn near the study that night. She could have taken the figurine. Evelyn snapped back, accusing Mrs. Bantry of meddling with the ledger. Hayworth and Mrs. Gray exchanged wary glances, while Sir Henry's hands shook. Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing them. The killer, she said, left clues. Grey fabric, rose petals, lavender, a torn page. But the rose garden holds the final piece. She turned to read. Constable, have your men dig beneath the trellis where Finch died. I suspect you'll find the figurine, and proof of the killer's haste. Reed hesitated, then nodded, sending a man to the garden. The guests waited, their breaths held as minutes stretched. Finally, the constable returned, muddy and grim, holding the jade figurine, its surface wrapped in a grey shawl. Mrs. Gray's, a bloodied letter, half buried with it, bore Thomas Gray's signature. Ashford's debt is mine to collect. Mrs. Gray gasped, her composure shattered. I didn't kill him, she cried. I took the figurine to end this curse, but Finch was already dead. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. You hid the figurine, Mrs. Gray, but the blood on the trowel, the petals, the lavender, they point elsewhere. Agatha turned to Dr. Hayworth, whose face had gone grey. Doctor, your cufflink betrays you. Your father's role in the theft drove Finch to confront you. You stabbed him in the garden, staged the trowel, and planted Mrs. Gray's shawl to mislead. The petals were your error, scattered in panic, linking each crime. When Jenny saw you, you struck her, but your haste left the key. Hayworth lunged for the door, but Reed was faster, pinning him. You've no proof, Hayworth shouted, but his cufflink, now loose, fell to the floor, its crest gleaming. The room exhaled, the truth laid bare. Miss Marple sighed, her trap sprung. The wager had been a spark, igniting greed and guilt, but the killer's checkmate was hers. Chapter 12. The Quiet After the Storm. The dawn broke gently over St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through the last wisps of storm clouds, as if the village itself were exhaling. In Willow Hall, the drawing-room was quiet, the ledger closed, the jade figurine now locked away under Constable Reed's care. Dr. Lionel Hayworth, unmasked as Mr. Finch's killer, had been taken into custody, his cufflink, and the rose petals his undoing. The wager that had sparked such chaos was over, but its echoes lingered in the weary faces of the guests. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting folded in her lap, her eyes tracing the rose garden where the tragedy had begun. The guests, freed from suspicion, gathered for a final breakfast, their voices subdued. Sir Henry, his charm dimmed by the ordeal, spoke little, his thoughts likely on the scandal his uncle's legacy had unearthed. Mrs. Bantry, her spirit returning, chattered nervously about returning to normalcy, while Colonel Bantry grunted his relief. Miss Evelyn Carver, her sharp edges softened by the truth, admitted to Miss Marple that she'd followed Finch out of greed, hoping to steal the figurine for herself, but had retreated when she saw him fall. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, her composure restored, approached Miss Marple with quiet gratitude. "I thought hiding the figurine would end my husband's curse," she confessed, her lavender scent faint now. I was wrong, but you saw the truth." Miss Marple nodded, her smile kind. Mrs. Gray's actions, though misguided, had been born of grief, not malice, and the bloodied letter found with the figurine was merely her attempt to reclaim her husband's honour. Constable Reed, though outshone by Miss Marple's deductions, had recovered the torn ledger page and the hidden room's documents, piecing together the full story. Dr. Hayworth's father, a silent partner in Reginald Ashford's artefact, theft had left his son a legacy of shame. When Finch uncovered proof of the figurine's illicit origins, Hayworth panicked, fearing ruin. He stabbed Finch in the rose garden, using the trowel to stage a crude crime, and scattered petals in haste. The attack on Jenny was a desperate bid to silence her fleeting glimpse of him, and the grey shawl stolen from Mrs. Gray was a clumsy attempt to shift blame. The scratched key, Miss Marple explained to Reed, was Hayworth's attempt to access the safe, though Mrs. Gray had beaten him to the figurine. The rose petals, a recurring clue, were his fatal mistake, linking the murder, the theft, and Jenny's attack. "People," Miss Marple said softly, "are careless when they're afraid." As the guests prepared to leave, Sir Henry offered a stiff apology, vowing to donate the figurine to a museum. Its curse no longer his burden. The ledger, its pledges now void, was burned in the fireplace, its ashes a final end to the wager. Mrs. Bantry, ever practical, declared it a dreadful business, but at least it's done. Miss Marple walked back to her cottage, the village waking around her. The roses in her own garden nodded in the breeze, untouched by the darkness of Willow Halls. She thought of Finch, driven by truth, but undone by greed, of Hayworth, whose fear turned him to murder, of the wager, a spark that had ignited old wounds. Human nature, she mused, was a puzzle as old as time, and no wager could outwit its frailties. Settling into her armchair, she picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly. St. Mary Mead was quiet again, its secrets tucked away, but Miss Marple knew they would surface anew. For now she savoured the calm, her sharp eyes already watching for the next ripple in the village's placid surface.